The sexual regime that we currently live under is organized by two central concepts: homosexuality and heterosexuality. Their rise to prominence is a relatively recent development. Both homosexuality and heterosexuality, in other words, are highly modern forms of identity and sexual practices. And in our discussions thus far, we've seen a lot of evidence of historians discouraging us from using this term when talking about past forms of sexual desire. And so I thought it might be helpful to have a brief lecture clarifying some of the differences between these earlier documented forms of erotic life and the concept that we today call homosexuality. First, some disclaimers are in order. Although we say that homosexuality is a modern form of sexual identity and practice, we should be careful to note that homosexuality is not superior to earlier sexual systems. And in addition to that, homosexuality is not altogether different from earlier sexual systems. We ought not fall prey to the temptation to see homosexuality as some form of progress and to see earlier pre-modern forms of sexuality as backward or underdeveloped in some case, because that's not true. There are doubtless continuities and correspondences between identities past and present. We don't want to use history to disqualify or to negatively judge certain kinds of sexual life. So we don't want to draw this distinction between archaic or primitive sexual practices and modern ones. To do this would be to use history as a strategy of exclusion, and that's not at all what the history of sexuality should be used for. In this attempt to distinguish the concept of homosexuality today from the other kinds of same-sex sexual desire and behavior that we've studied in the past, I want to lean on and rely on our old friend David Halperin, who has come up with, I think, is a pretty good conceptual scheme for distinguishing varieties of same-sex love and traditions, past versus present. In his book, How to Do the History of Sexuality, Halperin kind of puts forward a new approach to the history of sexuality. And doing this, he says, we have to make room both for certain things that have persisted over time and for those things that have changed with regard to people's sexual experiences. We don't want to emphasize the idea that sexuality is unchanging, because that would be essentialism, but we also don't want to say that pre-modern and modern sexual subjectivities are fundamentally different, because that's also not true. So what Halperin does in his book is he talks about this long historical process of accretion and accumulation and overlays. He says that there are many identity categories that have been attached historically to same-sex sexual practices, and some of those in earlier times overlap with the contemporary category that we call homosexuality. Nevertheless, none of those earlier forms fully align with the desires, the behaviors, the psychologies, and the socialities that today fall within the definitional boundaries of homosexuality. And in making this argument, Halperin puts forward a kind of genealogical analysis of homosexuality. Tracing these back to the past, he says that there have basically been 4 different kinds of pre-homosexual categories of sex and gender deviance. He calls them effeminacy, pederasty, the tradition of romantic friendship, and inversion. Each of these has been obscured, but not necessarily superseded or replaced by the 5th category, which is our idea of modern-day homosexuality. And for Halperin, the key difference between homosexuality and these earlier traditions is that only in homosexuality is sexuality privileged over gender as a marker of sexual difference. And so I want to explore that idea a little bit moving forward here in our discussion. As Halperin is a classicist, most of his evidence comes from the ancient Greek period, and we're going to stick with that. We've seen a lot of examples looking at the pre-modern world. We know that sexually deviant identities or characters existed. One of the most frequently written about, which existed across ancient Mediterranean societies, was that of the kinetos, or sometimes represented as chinedos if you're using Latin. Um, this idea of the kinetos arose out of a gender system in which man and woman were conceived of at opposite ends of a kind of sexual spectrum that could be traveled across very easily. The ancient Greeks and Romans tended to think that masculinity was something that one accomplished through internal and external struggle. So the defining feature of the kinetos was his gender deviant status, which was most notably demonstrated as a love of being penetrated sexually by other men. And as the ancients had it, within the existing gender system, all men were potentially at risk for becoming a kinetos, because anyone who gave up this struggle to resist pleasure and desire would become as such. That is to say, allowing other men to use them as objects of sexual degradation was regarded as feminine in the ancient world. The kinetos thus embodied the inversion of the ancient world's gender hierarchies. He was understood to be physically identifiable as a life form. He was said to have an effeminate appearance that was marked by things like weak eyes or knocking knees, a head that was tilted back, limp wrists, and most importantly, perhaps having hips that swung from side to side. The important thing about the kinetos was that it is not the same as homosexuality. What defined the kinetos was not his sexual desire for other men or his preference for taking the receptive role in anal intercourse. Some of these individuals, it should be noted, also engaged in sex with women, and yet they were still regarded as kinetos. Why? Because this was a man who simply failed to be fully masculine, whose effeminacy could be seen in the wearing of feminine clothing and the use of feminine mannerisms. As the scholar Craig Williams puts it in his book Roman Homosexuality, the deviance of the kinetos is ultimately a matter of gender identity rather than sexual identity, in the sense that the kinetos' predilection for playing the receptive role in penetrative acts was not the single defining feature of his identity, but rather a sign of a more fundamental transgression of gender categories. What this means is that the kinetos only partially overlaps with the figure of the modern homosexual. For one, the kinetos is identified in terms of gender identity rather than in terms of sexual desire. The kinetos was an affront to masculinity. That's what it challenged. It was not an affront to heterosexuality. For ancient writers, the kinetos' desire to be sexually penetrated was just a sign of femininity. That's all. Not a sign of having a sexually deviant sexual orientation. Kinetos were simply womanly and were not thought to possess a unique form of sexuality. All right, so if the figure of the effeminate kinetos fails to fully map onto our modern day concept of the homosexual, it should also be noted that this is true of pederasty, one of the sexual institutions in ancient Greece that we have discussed a fair amount in class. One of the best texts that we have exploring this tradition of pederasty in the ancient world is a 4th century Roman book by the philosopher Lucian, which is called Erotes. It's variously translated as The Two Kinds of Love or The Affairs of the Heart. It's basically a dialogue that takes place between two figures. They're both adult men, and they are debating the relative sexual merits of boys and women. This was a time-honored tradition in ancient Greek symposia. The first character, Charicles is his name, and he argues that men should prioritize sex with women. He makes a variety of different arguments for this. For one, he says that doing this helps ensure the continued survival of the species. In response, the other participant in this dialogue, his name is Kallikratidas, he argues that sex with boys is preferable. And he notes in response to Charicles that when it comes to sexual intercourse, the chief criteria should not be necessity. That's a direct response to Charicles' argument about the need for reproduction. But he says what's most important is beauty. Charicles says that, since animals only copulate with members of the opposite sex, this is the more natural form of sexuality. Kallikratidas rejects this. He says, opposite sex sexual activity between animals is just an indication of their mindlessness. And if animals are lower than us on the order of beings, why should we act like them? His next point, Charicles this is, in arguing for why sex between men and women is better, he says that it is mutually enjoyable, whereas that between boys and men might only be enjoyed by one member, that being the adult man. And finally, he says that only sex between men and women results in long-term relationships. There is a temptation, I think, to see Charicles' points as an argument against heterosexuality. However, we should take note of several things here. First, he says nothing about adult male homosexuality. Secondly, he is unconcerned with female homoeroticism. He references the idea of tribadism only once. And in addition to this, it bears noting that Kallikratidas also says nothing about adult homosexuality. Both agreed that adult men had no sexual appeal whatsoever. This is one of the things that suggests that there's a huge gap between ancient Mediterranean pederasty and, for example, middle-class gay love of the 20th and 21st centuries.